On November 23, 1940, Lord Lothian stepped off an airplane at New York's LaGuardia Airport and told a pack of waiting journalists something no diplomat should ever say out loud. "Britain's broke. It's your money we want." There was no spin, no diplomatic language, just a simple statement of fact that bordered on surrender. The British ambassador to the United States had just announced to the world that the greatest empire in history, the nation that controlled a quarter of the planet's surface, the financial center of global commerce for 2 centuries, was completely and utterly bankrupt. The reporters scribbled frantically. The quote hit the wire services within minutes. In London, officials winced. In Washington, Treasury bureaucrats smiled. The game was over. Britain had finally admitted what everyone already knew. The empire was dying, and it was dying because it had run out of money. This is not a story about military defeat. The British Army had not surrendered. The Royal Navy still controlled the seas. The Royal Air Force had just won the Battle of Britain against impossible odds. But none of that mattered because Britain was fighting 2 wars simultaneously. One war was against Nazi Germany. The other war was against mathematics. And in the autumn of 1940, mathematics was winning. To understand how the wealthiest nation on earth went bankrupt in 14 months, we need to go back to a decision made 15 years earlier. A decision that Winston Churchill himself would later call the biggest blunder of his life. In 1925, Churchill was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Britain had emerged from World War I victorious but economically shattered. The pound sterling, which had been the global reserve currency for a century, had weakened. Inflation had ravaged savings. The empire that had once financed the world was now drowning in debt. Churchill faced a choice. He could accept this new reality and let the currency adjust naturally, or he could try to restore Britain's pre-war dominance by returning to the gold standard at the old exchange rate.
Churchill chose pride.
He pegged the pound to gold at the same rate it had held before the war. It was a declaration that Britain was still the master of the global economy. But it was also an economic suicide note written in invisible ink that would only become legible 15 years later when the consequences came due. The problem was brutally simple. By overvaluing the pound, Churchill made British exports uncompetitive. British coal, British steel, British textiles, all suddenly too expensive for foreign buyers. Factories closed. Unemployment soared. The coal miners went on strike in 1926, nearly paralyzing the nation. But the real danger was invisible. Every time the pound weakened under economic pressure, gold flowed out of the Bank of England's vaults to defend the currency. It was a slow hemorrhage that could not be stopped without abandoning the gold standard entirely. And abandoning the gold standard would mean admitting that Britain was no longer a great power. For a decade, the bleeding continued. The reserves shrank quarter by quarter. Then September 1939 arrived. Germany invaded Poland. Britain declared war. And the slow bleed became a hemorrhage that would drain £800 million in gold in just over a year. The weapon that would destroy British financial independence was an American law called cash and carry. Passed by Congress in November 1939, it allowed nations at war to purchase American weapons and supplies, but with one non-negotiable condition: payment in advance. Gold, US dollars, or American securities only.
No loans.
No credit. No exceptions. If you wanted American steel, American oil, American aircraft engines, you put gold bars on the table before the cargo left New York. For Britain, this was a death sentence disguised as neutrality. The isolationist majority in Congress wanted to stay out of European wars, so they created a system that would let America profit without risking American lives. Britain could buy the weapons it needed to survive, but only by draining its treasury until nothing remained. The mathematics were apocalyptic. By December 1939, just 3 months into the war, Britain was spending £10 million in gold every single week. Treasury officials ran the projections. At that rate, the entire reserve would be exhausted by 1943. But the war would not be over by 1943. France was collapsing. The Luftwaffe was preparing to bomb British cities. U-boats were hunting Atlantic convoys. Britain needed aircraft, tanks, ammunition, fuel, food, and raw materials. Every purchase drained the vaults in London. Every shipment brought the moment of bankruptcy closer. Churchill understood this better than anyone because he had created the trap himself in 1925. Now, sitting in the underground war rooms beneath Whitehall, surrounded by maps tracking German advances, he watched his old mistake play out in real time. Britain was not just fighting Germany. It was fighting the calendar, fighting arithmetic. And arithmetic does not negotiate. By May 1940, 1940, the situation became critical. Germany invaded France. The French army, supposedly the strongest in Europe, collapsed in 6 weeks. Belgium surrendered. The Netherlands fell. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped at Dunkirk and evacuated in fishing boats and pleasure yachts. They escaped with their lives but left behind all their equipment. Every tank, every artillery piece, every rifle purchased with gold now sat abandoned on French beaches. With France gone, Britain stood alone. The German army massed on the coast just 21 miles across the English Channel. Invasion was no longer a theoretical threat. It was an operational plan. The Wehrmacht was assembling barges. The Luftwaffe was preparing to destroy the Royal Air Force. Hitler was preparing to finish what he started. On June 4, 1940, Winston Churchill stood before Parliament and delivered his famous defiance. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender." The rhetoric soared. The nation rallied. But behind the words, Churchill was calculating a darker scenario. What happens if the Germans land? What happens if London falls? The answer was obvious. If Germany occupied Britain, they would seize everything. The factories, the ports, the shipyards. And most critically, they would seize the vaults of the Bank of England. The gold reserves were not just money. They were the collateral backing British purchases from America. They were the last bargaining chip Britain possessed. If Germany seized them, the war was over. Not because British soldiers stopped fighting, but because Britain could no longer pay for weapons. Churchill made a decision that would define the rest of the war. He ordered the gold evacuated. Every bar, every ingot, every reserve would be loaded onto ships and sent across the Atlantic to Canada. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in modern history. It was an admission that Britain could not defend its own capital. But it was also the only move left. The operation received a deliberately vague code name, Operation Fish. Nothing about the name revealed what was being transported or why. But the stakes could not have been higher. Britain was about to gamble its entire financial future on a transatlantic journey through waters patrolled by German submarines. If even one convoy was intercepted, if even one ship went down, the loss would be catastrophic. Britain would lose both the gold and the ability to continue buying weapons. The first test convoy departed Plymouth on October 7, 1939. 2 ancient battleships from World War I, HMS Revenge and HMS Resolution, were loaded with 148 boxes of gold bars worth £2 million. They crossed the Atlantic slowly, arriving in Halifax, Nova Scotia without incident. The gold was unloaded under armed guard and transferred by sealed train to Ottawa. Success. But this was just the beginning. By late May 1940, with France collapsing and invasion imminent, the pace accelerated. On May 30th, HMS Revenge departed again carrying 2,229 cases containing £40 million in gold. The ship made the crossing safely, but Churchill knew this was nowhere near enough. Hundreds of millions of pounds remained in London. Thousands of tons of bullion. It all had to move. Fast. On June 24, 1940, the light cruiser HMS Emerald departed Greenock, Scotland with £58 million in gold in her hold. This was the most dangerous crossing yet. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun. German U-boats were hunting convoys with ruthless efficiency. 2 destroyers escorted the Emerald initially, but halfway across, a massive Atlantic storm hit. Gales so violent the destroyers had to turn back. They could not keep pace with the heavily laden cruiser. The Emerald was alone in the middle of the ocean, riding low in the water because of the gold's weight, with German submarines prowling beneath the surface. Captain Augustus Agar, a decorated Victoria Cross recipient from World War I, commanded the Emerald. The storm battered his ship for days. Waves the height of buildings crashed over the deck. The ship lost her spotter plane, lifeboats, depth charges, critical equipment. The crew worked in round-the-clock shifts, pumping water, securing cargo, praying the hull would hold. If the ship went down, the gold would sink with it, and Britain's ability to buy weapons would sink with the gold. But the Emerald did not sink. After 7 days of hell, she arrived in Halifax. The crew was exhausted. The ship was damaged, but the gold was intact. Sidney Perkins, the Bank of Canada official receiving the shipment, stood on the Halifax dock and watched as box after box of gold bars was swung down from the ship's hold using cargo nets. Years Years later, he would describe the moment with eerie clarity. Seeing tens of millions in gold piled on the quay gave him a cold chill. Not excitement, not joy, just a profound unease. This was not treasure. This was the lifeblood of a dying empire being transfused across an ocean in desperation. The convoys continued throughout summer and fall 1940. Ship after ship, gold after gold. By year's end, more than 1,500 tons of gold bullion had been transferred from London to Canada. In today's currency, approximately $67 billion US. But gold was not the only cargo. Britain also shipped securities, stock certificates, bonds, investment portfolios. Anything with dollar value was crated and sent across the Atlantic. The securities were even more complex to handle than gold. Paper can burn. Paper can be forged. Paper can be lost in transit. Teams of Bank of England clerks verified every certificate, recorded every serial number, ensured nothing went missing. In Montreal, the securities were stored in a custom-built vault 3 stories underground in the Sun Life building. The building's 5,000 employees came to work daily, walking above one of the largest financial hoards in the Western Hemisphere without knowing it existed. British officials spread a cover story that the crown jewels were stored there. It was a lie designed to distract from a truth far more valuable than jewels. In Ottawa, the gold arrived by sealed railcar at Union Station. Armed guards transferred it to armored trucks that drove through empty pre-dawn streets to the Bank of Canada on Wellington Street. The vault was 60 feet by 100 feet, built to hold Canada's reserves, not the reserves of an empire. Within weeks, it overflowed. Gold bars stacked on floors. Auditors crawling between stacks to verify inventory. When the vault ran out of space, gold was stored in hallways, in incinerator rooms, anywhere with a locked door. A young bank clerk working late one night opened a supply closet and found it packed floor to ceiling with gold bars. He closed the door without a word and walked away. He knew better than to ask questions. The operation involved thousands of people. Dock workers, soldiers, bank clerks, train conductors, truck drivers, security guards. Every person who touched the gold understood what was at stake. If word leaked, if German intelligence learned the schedule, U-boats would be waiting. Ships would sink. Britain would lose the war. So they stayed silent. Not one photograph leaked during the war. Not one journalist broke the story. It remained classified until after 1945. One of history's most remarkable collective secrets. But shipping the gold was not enough. By autumn 1940, Britain had moved hundreds of millions of pounds to Canada, yet the hemorrhage continued. Cash and carry was relentless. Every week brought new weapons purchases. Every week the vaults emptied further. Treasury officials projected the gold would last until early 1941, maybe mid-1941 if carefully rationed. After that, nothing. And when it ran out, Britain could no longer buy American supplies. The war effort would collapse. The nation would starve. Germany would win by default. Churchill sat at his desk in the underground war rooms and wrote one of the most important letters of his life, addressed to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Churchill was a master wordsmith who could turn phrases into weapons, but this letter was different. This was not a speech. This was a confession. Churchill told Roosevelt that Britain was running out of money. He wrote that the moment was approaching when the British Treasury would no longer be able to pay cash for the supplies needed to survive. Britain would fight on the beaches and landing grounds, but could not fight without ammunition, and could no longer afford to buy it. A plea for survival, an admission of insolvency, the moment when the greatest empire in history admitted it was broke. The letter reached Roosevelt in December 1940. Roosevelt understood immediately. If Britain fell, the United States would be next. Nazi Germany would control Europe. Imperial Japan would control Asia. America would be isolated, surrounded by hostile powers. Helping Britain was not charity. It was American survival. But Roosevelt faced a political problem. The isolationist American public opposed foreign aid. Congress was hostile to involvement. He could not simply give money to Britain. The law forbade it. He needed a mechanism that looked like business, not charity. He needed to sell the war effort to American taxpayers. This is where Lend-Lease was born. Roosevelt explained it with a folksy analogy. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't haggle over the price of a garden hose. You lend him the hose. He returns it when the fire's out. Simple, neighborly, temporary. But the reality of negotiations in Washington was entirely different. Not a conversation between neighbors. A foreclosure proceeding between a bank and a bankrupt client. The man running the American Treasury was Henry Morgenthau Jr., a staunch anti-fascist who wanted Britain to defeat Hitler. settler, but also the guardian of American taxpayers. He believed that before the United States gave a single dime, Britain had to prove it had stripped itself of every last asset. No hidden money, full transparency. Morgenthau demanded a complete audit of the British Empire. He wanted to see every asset owned by the British government and every asset owned by private British citizens anywhere in the world. The value of every shell casing, every woolen sock, every share of stock. The British negotiators were stunned. They were being asked to open their books to a foreign power, treated not as an ally but as a failed company in receivership. Sir Frederick Phillips, the British Treasury official leading negotiations, tried to argue. Britain had already sold its gold. Liquidating long-term investments mid-war would be a fire sale. Pennies on the dollar. Stripping Britain of overseas income would leave the country destitute after the war, unable to feed its population or rebuild. Morgenthau was unmoved. Roosevelt's instructions were clear. The United States would not provide aid until Britain scraped the bottom of the barrel. The logic was brutal but simple. If Britain still had assets in the United States, why should American taxpayers subsidize the war? Why should an Iowa farmer pay for British tanks if a British lord owned a factory in New Jersey? The most painful symbol of forced liquidation was American Viscose Corporation, a massive industrial giant, the largest rayon and artificial silk manufacturer in the United States, owned by British company Courtaulds, highly profitable, generating millions yearly in dividends flowing to London, balancing Britain's trade deficit, a jewel of British overseas investment. Morgenthau identified it as a target. He told British negotiators they had to sell. Cash from the sale would go to the U.S. Treasury to pay for existing weapons orders. The British resisted. The company was worth over $100 million. Selling in a wartime rush would be financial suicide. But Morgenthau held leverage. The Lend-Lease bill was moving through Congress. Isolationists were attacking it, claiming Britain was rich and tricking America into paying its bills. Morgenthau needed a sacrificial lamb to prove Britain was bleeding. He gave an ultimatum: sell American viscose or Lend-Lease dies in committee. On Sunday, March 15, 1941, under immense Washington pressure, the British government seized American Viscose Corporation from its owners. No permission asked. A compulsory purchase order under emergency war powers. The sale was handled by American investment bankers. Because everyone knew the British had to sell, the bankers drove a merciless bargain. Sold for roughly $54 million. Highway robbery. The company was worth at least double. The British government had to reimburse Courtaulds in pounds back home, adding to internal debt, while dollars from the sale went straight to the U.S. Treasury for rifles and aircraft engines. The Viscose sale was a turning point. The moment British elites realized the true price of survival. They were not partners with the United States. They were a junior entity being stripped of assets to pay for existence. The United States was absorbing British Empire wealth not by conquest but by contract. But industrial assets were just the beginning. Between February and mid-1941, Britain forcibly seized and liquidated $1.1 billion in U.S. securities and stocks from British citizens. The Emergency Powers Act allowed the government to requisition any American securities held by Britons. Notices went out demanding registration. Seized assets were auctioned on Wall Street to raise dollars. Imagine being a British citizen in 1941. German bombs falling on your city every night. Your house might be destroyed tomorrow. Your children might die. And the government knocks on your door, tells you the American stocks your grandfather left you, the dividend income paying for food, has been confiscated. The government takes the certificates, sells them on Wall Street, uses the money for weapons. You receive no compensation, just a thank you letter from the Treasury and assurance you're doing your patriotic duty. Every widowed woman with inherited American dividend stocks. Every businessman using American securities as loan collateral. Every pension fund holding U.S. bonds. All conscripted without compensation into paying for American weapons. The psychological and economic blow was staggering. British citizens were not just asked to endure the war. They were asked to liquidate their futures to survive the present. Bitterness was palpable. A New York Times article from March 18, 1941 captured the mood. The Viscose sale proved Britain's desperation but raised uncomfortable questions about the post-war world. If Britain was stripped of all foreign assets, How would it finance imports afterward? How would it continue thriving? The unspoken answer, it wouldn't. Britain was trading long-term prosperity for short-term survival, selling the future to pay for the present. Finally, in March 1941, the Lend-Lease Act was signed, publicly hailed as the arsenal of democracy, presented as noble solidarity. In many ways, it provided tanks, planes, oil, food that kept Britain alive. Without it, Nazis likely would have starved the British Isles into submission. But the financial terms laid groundwork for a post-war world where Britain would be debtor and America would be creditor. The aid was not a gift, it was a lease, the assumption there would be a reckoning, a consideration. The Lend-Lease Agreement contained a clause known as Article 7, a small paragraph in dense diplomatic language containing a poison pill for the British Empire. It stated that in return for aid, Britain would agree to dismantle its imperial preference system after the war. Imperial preference was the economic wall holding the British Empire together, a tariff system favoring trade between Britain and its colonies, Canada, Australia, India, South Africa. British goods were cheaper in empire markets than American goods, the mechanism allowing British industry to survive against more efficient American competition. By signing Article 7, Britain agreed to tear down its own economic defenses, agreed to open its empire to American exporters, signed the death warrant of its own trading bloc. British negotiators fought Article 7. They knew it meant the end of empire as an economic unit, but no choice remained. German bombers overhead, U-boats in the Atlantic, cash gone. They signed. As 1941 turned to 1942 and the United States officially entered after Pearl Harbor, dynamics shifted again. Britain and America fighting side by side. American soldiers pouring into Britain. The island becoming an immense aircraft carrier for the U.S. Army Air Force. But financial disparity only grew. American industry, fueled by government spending, exploded in size and efficiency. U.S. economy growing by enormous percentages annually. Britain's economy being distorted and cannibalized by war effort. Britain stopped exporting, converted every factory to war production, abandoned markets in Latin America and Asia. Who stepped into those markets? American companies. While British factories made Spitfires, American factories made Spitfires and refrigerators and radios and cars for global markets. The United States fighting the war while simultaneously stealing Britain's commercial future. By 1944, wealth transfer was absolute. Global gold reserves moved from London to Fort Knox. Financial center of gravity shifted across the Atlantic. But final humiliation awaited. British believed their sacrifice would be honored. Because they fought alone against Hitler for 2 years, bankrupted themselves saving the world, Americans would treat them generously after victory. Lend-Lease would continue for a transition period. There would be a soft landing. They were wrong. They forgot the lesson of viscose. They forgot that in high finance, gratitude is not currency. August 15, 1945. News flashed worldwide. Japan surrendered. World War II over. In London, crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace.
Bon firli.
Strangers hugged in streets. Pure joy. Axis tyranny crushed. The British Empire stood alone against darkness and prevailed. But across the Atlantic in Washington, D.C., no sentimentality existed. Only a cold bureaucratic machine waiting for this exact moment to switch gears. 7 days after victory celebrations began, President Harry Truman signed a paper devastating the British economy more effectively than any German bomb. He signed the order terminating Lend-Lease. The cutoff was brutal and immediate, absolute. As of that moment, all aid stopped.
No transition.
No grace period. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, American Liberty ships loaded with wheat, meat, tools bound for Liverpool were ordered to turn around and sail back to the United States. The lifeline severed. British government paralyzed by shock. They assumed aid would continue to help rebuild. Assumed their economy, completely distorted fighting a common war, would be given time to adjust to peace. John Maynard Keynes, legendary economist and government advisor, looked at numbers and saw the abyss. Britain importing half its food and almost all raw materials. Paying with Lend-Lease dollars. Without those dollars, Britain was bankrupt. Not in a year, year, not in a month. Instantly, Keynes calculated Britain faced a financial Dunkirk. The country would have to default on payments, stop importing food, rations, meager during war, would be cut to starvation levels. Industries would have no raw materials, mass unemployment, social collapse. Only one option remained. Britain had to beg. September 1945, a dying John Maynard Keynes boarded a ship for Washington. Sick, exhausted, suffering from a heart condition that would soon kill him. The greatest economic mind of the century going to America not as intellectual but as supplicant. Keynes believed he had a moral case. He planned to walk into the U.S. Treasury and argue Britain fought alone for 2 years while America remained neutral. Britain sacrificed its entire economy saving Western civilization. Therefore, the United States should give Britain a gift. A grant, $6 billion. Not a loan but retroactive payment for blood and treasure Britain spent holding the line. He called it justice. When he arrived in Washington, he found justice was not currency Americans recognized. The mood had changed. War over. American public tired of paying for Europe. Politicians in Congress suspicious of Britain's new Labour government, elected on a platform of socialism and nationalizing industries. They didn't want American capitalist tax dollars funding British socialist experiments. American negotiators were hard-faced men. They looked at Keynes with cold eyes, told him bluntly, no gift, no grant, only a loan on commercial terms with interest. Keynes was devastated. He argued, pleaded, warned that crushing Britain financially would destroy a vital ally against the rising Soviet threat. But Americans held all cards. They knew Britain had nowhere else to go. They offered a loan of $3.75 billion, barely enough to survive, and it came with strings designed to strangle the last remnants of British Empire economic independence. The most poisonous condition was sterling convertibility. Americans demanded that within 1 year of receiving the loan, Britain must make the pound sterling fully convertible. Anyone in the world holding British pounds could walk into a bank and exchange them for US dollars. Americans framed this as free trade, opening global markets. In reality, it was designed to break the sterling area. During the war, Britain forced its colonies and trading partners to accept pounds but forbidden them from exchanging pounds for dollars. This forced countries like India, Australia, Egypt to buy British goods because their money was only good in Britain. A closed loop protecting British industry. Americans wanted to smash that loop. They knew if the pound became convertible, everyone holding pounds would immediately sell to buy dollars. Because everyone wanted American goods, not British. American cars were better. American refrigerators were better. American machines were better. Keynes knew this condition was a death trap. The moment convertibility was introduced, there would be a run on the pound, draining the loan in weeks. He fought against it until his health broke. But the alternative was starvation. Reluctantly, bitterly, British Parliament voted to accept the loan. They described it as a financial Munich, appeasing Americans to survive. Loan agreement signed July 1946. Keynes died months later, his heart finally giving out under stress of trying to save his country from its closest ally. But tragedy was just beginning. Winter 1947 was the coldest in living memory. Blizzards buried the country in snow. Coal stockpiles froze. Power stations shut down. Factories closed. People shivered in unheated homes, lighting candles because no electricity existed. In this frozen darkness, the reality of victory came home to British people. They won the war, but their standard of living was plummeting. Bread, never rationed even during darkest U-boat blockade days, was rationed in peacetime. The age of austerity had begun. Then the clock struck on the American condition. July 15, 1947. Per loan terms, Britain made the pound sterling fully convertible. The result was exactly what Keynes predicted. Financial massacre. The moment the window opened, the world rushed to sell pounds. Countries stockpiling sterling for years unloaded it to get precious US dollars. Money from the American loan, supposed to last years, began evaporating. In 1 month, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars. The hemorrhage so violent the government watched in horror as reserves vanished. Bleeding to death. After 5 weeks, August 20th, 1947, British government forced to suspend convertibility. Slammed the window shut. Had to go to U.S. Treasury admitting total failure. Burned through huge portion of the loan for nothing. Humiliation total. British Empire tried playing by American rules and was crushed. This financial weakness had immediate geopolitical consequences. The moment the baton of world power was officially dropped by London and picked up by Washington. February 1947, British British government sent secret telegram to U.S. State Department, a message of resignation. For a century, Britain had been guardian of Greece and Turkey, keeping Russians out of the Mediterranean. Now, with treasury empty, Britain could no longer afford paying soldiers or subsidizing Greek government. The telegram essentially said, "We're broke, we're leaving, if you want to stop communists, you have to do it." This telegram triggered the Truman Doctrine. United States stepped in to fill the vacuum. Formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a superpower capable of shaping global events. A regional power trying to keep lights on. Economic misery dragged on. In 1949, with economy still stagnant and reserves low, government forced to devalue the pound. Before the war, pound worth $4.86. In 1949, slashed to $2.80. Overnight, British people became 30% poorer relative to the rest of the world. Imports more expensive. Cost of living rose. Recognition that British economy was no longer competitive. But the final bill for the war wasn't just paid in the 1940s. It was a mortgage spanning generations. The Anglo-American loan of 1946, money borrowed to keep Britain from starving after victory, was not a gift. Commercial debt with interest. Every year for 6 decades, British Treasury wrote a check to U.S. Treasury. Through the boom of the 50s, through gloom of the 70s, through Thatcher years and Blair years, payments continued. Final payment made December 29, 2006. 61 years after guns fell silent. 61 years after victory parades. British taxpayers still paying for the privilege of having survived World War II. Operation Fish was successful. Not one ship carrying Britain's gold sunk by enemy action. Gold remained secure. Securities preserved. Britain had its financial cushion to continue purchasing American arms. Yet it was also defeat. The defeat of a great power accepting its own subordination to ensure survival. Churchill, who spent a lifetime defending British imperial interests, forced to watch as economic sinews of empire were liquidated to pay for weapons made in Detroit. The last payment on Britain's World War II debt took 61 years. 3 generations of British taxpayers, children or not yet born when war ended, made payments to an American government that had long since moved on. But without Operation Fish, without Churchill's willingness to gamble the nation's last pound sterling on a transatlantic crossing through U-boat waters, without forced liquidation of private assets, without acceptance of economic dependency, Britain would have lost the war. Nazi Germany would have conquered Britain, occupied Europe, potentially dominated the globe. The cost of survival was steep, but the alternative was unthinkable. Operation Fish was not heroic military victory or brilliant diplomatic triumph. It was an act of economic sacrifice. Emptying the vaults to keep lights on, pumps running, guns firing long enough for America to enter the war and tip the balance. The gold crossed the Atlantic in darkness, unmarked and unnamed, carrying the entire future of British power. When it arrived in Ottawa and Montreal, it was more than bullion. It was the physical embodiment of surrender and salvation.